with that Hughes Brothers too. Klein Williams, based out of Lincoln and Omaha. But yeah, if you don't know a good attorney, you want to find one. Because there are definitely going to be situations where you want to just make sure that you are actually taking the right steps. I mean, if you have a bad feeling about a situation, trust your gut on that. Get an attorney involved, network with the other people, and just say, hey, this is my situation, what would you do? And I do that a lot with my network people too, because one of the things is somebody out there has faced the same situation as you before. You're probably not the first one to have to go through that. So networking is really key when it comes to that. And so, I mean, there's a lot of organizations that you can join. I'm sure there's probably the superintendents meet, the principals meet, so that's a great time to network. As you saw on the resources, I had found a quick article on all of the things that Trump had signed into law in the last year, and I know not all of them were true laws. I just found that interesting just because I know, looking at what the legislature is doing right now, obviously there's a couple of key things out there that are going to potentially impact education, depending on what happens with those. But compliance is one of those things that, I think it's more difficult every year. I mean, I've been doing HR 20 years now, and you think it'd be easier after 20 years, but I think it's more difficult than ever. I mean, even in schools, you've got the bullying and the social media. I mean, my goodness, I would not want to go back to high school today, I'll just say that, right? Because I don't know how I would do it with Snapchat and all these other things that they have going on. I run it into the workplace too. Even with adults, I feel like I'm running a junior high school most days because it's still, people fight with one another and they come in and they're like, well, so-and-so posted this about me on Facebook, and I'm like, I'm not getting involved in that. One of the situations where, I mean, it was pretty defaming what was said, and I'm like, you can go to the police. We don't have any policies internally right now at Hughes Brothers, which is something I've been trying to change, but we're a family-owned business, and our owners are very old school. They just don't want to be involved in any kind of conflict. But if there are certain things, I just tell people, if you feel it's that big of a threat, then go to the police. If they felt there was something on Facebook. But it does make it difficult. Any of these social media things, people are not supposed to be on their phones at work, but I'll have somebody come in and say, well, they posted this at 2 o'clock, that was when they were working. So it just creates a challenge, just like cell phones in the classroom. I think from the time probably when Chad was first a principal in Seward, they at first had a policy about no phones in the classroom at all, and it was the keep them in your locker to all that, to now it's pretty much teachers embracing them in the classroom, and how do you utilize them so that they can learn. Kind of neat tricks. I know one of the teachers has a little pocket thing on their door, so as they walk in, every student has to put their cell phone in a pocket, if they're not using in there. So I know it makes it challenging for all of you as well, so it's no different in the workplace either. Yes. Sorry.
I have heard, I don't necessarily agree with it, but that a person that I know in the HR said that if you don't have a policy, that makes you less liable.
Yes and no. It's kind of what they say about handbooks too. If your handbook's not going to be up to date and really with what you're doing, you're better off not having one because you're not following what you actually have in writing. So it could be set true, if you look at it that way. But what I would say is that if there is something that's critical or something that you get faced with, it's probably better to have the board think about putting a policy in place to help address it. The problem is once it's in black and white, then you're bound to follow it exactly like it says.
No, we don't want to do that.
So that's the thing is, can you as a staff figure out how are you generally going to address that issue? Because that's probably more important, that everybody is enforcing whatever the rule is consistently. And that's a challenge that I have too, because I have, I'm trying to think, 25 different foremen for all the different groups that we have, and I think that's one of my biggest challenges is consistent, equitable enforcement in every department. We have a list of shop rules because we're a union environment as well, and we do have a policy in place about no cell phones, but I can guarantee you when I go walking through the plant, first of all, when people see me, they start scattering because they're like, crap, here she comes, right? But, if somebody has their cell phone out and I see it, I normally go right up to them and I'm like, what are you doing? I normally just give them that general warning, put it back away. If I circle around and I come back and that person's still on their cell phone, well, then I'm probably gonna write them up because they know they're not supposed to have that. But again, how do you address that? It's different. You had a question
Well, I was
too.
just going back to that, in the education side, I'm seeing more issues with discipline on the social media.
Mhm.
It's not happening during the day, but because of what's happening, so I'm thinking with employees.
Mhm.
And it creates a hostile and an unsafe, or if an employee comes to you and says, someone's making these threats, I don't feel safe, how do you address that if it's a hostile work environment?
If it gets to that situation, then it would have to be more of an investigation would need to be conducted.
Okay.
Because, especially if there's probably more to it than the social media post in that case. Especially if somebody would come to me and say that they feel threatened or unsafe, especially if it's two coworkers that both are there. Because then, yes, it's raising more than just an issue for those two people, but potentially the whole department or the whole company in situations like that. And so, again, I would open up an investigation, probably have to talk to each one of them. Not so much focus on just what the social media posts were, but are there any activities that have happened at work that lead them to feel that they're unsafe or they're in a hostile working environment? Because people, unfortunately, like to throw out that they're being harassed.
Mhm.
I mean,
Bullied.
yes, and I hear that term even at work with adults, I'm being bullied. Well, what kind of behavior do you see? Is it just because you guys have two different personalities and you don't get along, and you don't like how they're talking to you? Or really what is bullying? And I'll tell you, it's difficult to define sometimes, because it all comes down to tolerance. You know, it's just, one of those things that when I meet with new employees, and we're walking through both the contract book and our handbook, one of those policies that we have is about sexual harassment. And, again, what's the general rule of thumb there? Well, it's hard to really do that because her level of tolerance and mine might be a lot different. If somebody's telling dirty jokes over there, she might be offended, but I'm not. So how do you deal with that? And so I think sometimes what you have to look at is what is offensive to somebody and what is reasonably offensive to somebody. And it might be that it's different. If that person is strictly religious, they don't like any of that, they can be offended and still come in and file a claim and may have to address it. But I usually tell people, if it's not something that you say or do in front of your mother, your grandmother, your pastor, something like that, should you really be doing it now? I mean, and again, I work in a manufacturing environment, so there's a lot of profanity on the floor, I'll be honest, because people will come into me and they're F-bombing this, I'm like, and I just kind of have to say, stop, okay, I don't want to hear the F words or whatever in my office. I mean, I still go on and have that conversation, but unfortunately, that's how they talk all the time out on the plant floor. So again, it creates a different environment for me, because obviously in schools, you guys are going to have policies in place that they can't use the profanity in the classroom. But it does make it hard to deal with, because it's hard for me to determine what's always reasonable in that situation. And sometimes that investigation will flush out from witnesses what actually might have happened. It's difficult. It is difficult. We do have security cameras in our facility too, but they're not covering every square inch of our property. So again, if there's something more of a physical altercation, or there's something that might have happened, sometimes I can go back and look at security cameras, which a lot of schools now have those too, but you can't hear what's being said, it's just pictures. So sometimes it helps you, sometimes it doesn't. The best thing is to ask, were there any witnesses, or where are you at, and go around and ask some of the people in that environment that maybe didn't realize they saw something, can they help you with that investigation? When you figure out how to handle that, I'd like to know, because it's,
That's what I was asking you.
it's I wish I had a crystal ball and a magic wand, I'll be honest, because I think that would help us get through a lot of those situations. Even with President Trump coming into office, again, just getting back on the benefit side, he's been trying to repeal the Affordable Care Act and how all of that works, and he's not been successful. If any of you have been following the news the last 18 months or whatever it's been, there's still going to be components of that still in place, that you're going to be required to report to your employees what that insurance benefit is, those 1095Bs, 1095Cs, those kind of things are still having to happen. I don't know how many of you have to do anything with that right now, but essentially, you're still required to take that piece of paper when you file your taxes to show that you have health insurance right now. So that may still change coming up in the next year. Sounds like some of the penalties and fines have been waived already for this year if you don't have insurance, but it's hard to keep up with. I try to focus on just what I have here, and I try to run out and refresh myself for the presentation, because again, I get so tunnel vision on just what impacts us at Hughes Brothers that I don't always look at what's happening in the rest of the world and things like that. And only because Chad's coming home talking about these education bills that are on the table, that I even really understand what you guys are potentially faced with, especially with, you know, cutting administrators' pay to a certain percentage, and how, you know, like in David City, you know, they're talking they'd have to basically cut all, I think there's 11 administrators between their special ed director up to where he is. They either have to cut everybody's salary in half in order to meet that threshold, or they would have to, I think, let go 4 administrators. You know, that's, how is that reasonable? You know, again, I'm probably biased too, just like you, because education's important, but it's just really interesting to see how that impacts different things. One of the things that we are a member of at Hughes Brothers is the Nebraska Chamber of Commerce. And that's something too that as a school district you could consider, because one of the nice things that we get usually every day is an email board, and then I also get every week a legislative report and kind of a bill tracker, because they have people there who are paid members to kind of follow the bills and kind of give more information on what's happening. So like, for example, I know this coming week here on education, they've got a couple of the bills that they're gonna be discussing. So it's just kind of interesting, and I can kind of pass those around to look at if anybody wants to see them. But kind of something, if it's in your school district, if you have a lot of things going, especially OPS, LPS, I'm guessing you guys might have lobbyists that work, you know, with, okay, because definitely it's a bigger impact for your school districts. Anything else on compliance issues before I move on? Again, a couple of those local, and even state and Nebraska, excuse me, state and federal resources. If you just go to the departmentoflabor.gov or the dol.nebraska.gov, you're gonna find a lot of those required postings that you have to have. One of the things that I want to talk about too is the Fair Labor Standards Act before I move on to the next thing. How many of you have bus drivers who are also custodians? Okay, a couple of you. So one of the things to keep in mind with that, and I don't know if everybody always looks at this, but technically you have to make sure that you're including all of their hours in one paycheck. You know, you can't just pay them over here for the bus driver and pay them separately for the custodian, and if they work 60 hours, not pay them any overtime. You know, and so one of the things to consider is the law says that any time after 40 hours in a work week needs to be paid at time and a half. So again, kind of one of those things that you may not think about, but again, when Chad became a superintendent, I got a lot of phone calls from him that first year just as he was looking at all of the things, you know, that he was in charge of, and that was one of the ones that he happened to catch, is they were not paying those staff members correctly that were both bus drivers and custodians, because they were treating it as 2 separate jobs rather than as one employee. So, something to think about. We've talked a little bit about this already, counseling, discipline issues, making sure you have that proper documentation, completing an investigation if needed, as we were just visiting on that, and then succession planning. You know, maybe in education it's not as big of an issue because it's not a clean-cut plan for everybody, because I mean, obviously if a teacher leaves, you're going to replace that teacher. In a business environment, it probably becomes a little bit more critical, because if I have my vice president controller pass away, do we have somebody behind him or her that could step in and do that job if need be? We have a lot of people in our organization that have been there. I think I have 15 people that have been there 40 or more years. And so I have, you know, and probably at least 30 people that have been there over 25 years, at least in the office environment. So I have a lot of key people retiring in the next 3 to 5 years, a lot of supervisors. And so from a planning standpoint, because what we do is so unique, I mean, you can't go out and get a degree in what we do at Hughes Brothers when we manufacture our parts. So one of the things I've been trying to convince my owners is, let's hire a management trainee for these 5 foremen that are going to retire in the next 3 to 5 years, because it's going to take a good year to 2 years for them to really gain the same amount of knowledge that the person before them has. But again, it's kind of one of those things that you have to look at what are your goals for the organization, and not every position needs a succession plan. If I got an accounting clerk and that person quits tomorrow, you can go hire another accounting clerk. It's going to be more your key positions that you definitely want, you know, a plan in place if you can, how you're going to handle that. Again, an education that may or may not apply in some of your areas, but it is definitely something that we look at in the business world. One of the fun things I do get to do, since like I said, everybody kind of scatters when they see me come in, it's just like being a principal, and I'll be honest. It's hard to explain to our 3 kids who are now, see, 15, 13, and 10, when they were a lot younger, what I did. And so I just kind of told them, I'm the principal of Hughes Brothers. If somebody gets in trouble,